Welcome back. Today I'm sharing how to make this cute yet spooky zombie cake. I had a ton of fun making this cake, but it took a lot of cake layers to make it. I used my classic red velvet cake recipe to make this cake, which can be made in one bowl by hand. I start off by adding in my oil, my eggs, then my buttermilk, and a little bit of distilled vinegar. I also added in my vanilla extract, and then I whisked everything together until it was nice and smooth. The oil and the buttermilk might seem to be separated at first, but the more you whisk, they will come together, I promise. Once this mixture was nice and smooth, I added in my granulated sugar and whisked that really well just to help the sugar start to dissolve. Once I felt like that was pretty smooth, I added in my baking soda and salts. I also added in my cocoa powder and gave this a really good stir to make sure there were no bits of cocoa left in the batter. You could also sift your cocoa to help prevent that. The final step is to add in my flour, which I'm adding in half of, and then I'm gently folding into my wet ingredients before adding in the other half. To prevent overmixing, I usually add the gel food coloring in before I add the flour, but in this case I'm adding about 2 cups of batter into a separate bowl because I'm going to color that portion red. That's going to be the zombie's brain, and then the rest of my batter I'm going to color a deep shade of green to be the zombie's body. I'm using gel food coloring here just because it gives the cake layers such a beautiful, vibrant color, and you don't need a lot to achieve that look. I'm using a ton of cake pans here. I'm going to walk through all the sizes, and I also am lining and greasing them with nonstick spray before adding in my batter. I bake these cake layers in a preheated 350-degree oven for 25 to 30 minutes. While those were baking, I worked on my zombie frosting. I had some leftover buttercream that I repurposed and added to the different colors of frosting I was making. So I made a big bowl of green frosting, which I covered with plastic wrap just to prevent any crusting while it sat. Then I went to work creating my pinkish red frosting for my zombie brains, and also some purple buttercream to make the zombie's shirt. So you can make these whatever shade you want, or you can make the zombie wear whatever color shirt you want. Just be sure to cover them with plastic wrap so that they stay nice and fresh for when you want to add them to your cake. Once my cake layers had baked and cooled, I used a serrated knife to level off the top. They bake pretty flat on their own, but it makes it a lot easier, especially with a tall tiered cake like this, if you level them. You also get to snack on the tops while you're making the cake, which is one of my favorite things to do. The cake tops have a delicious amount of caramelization on them, and they're actually my very favorite part to eat of any cake. Here's a quick sketch of how I envisioned this cake looking. It didn't come out quite like this, but I think I stayed pretty true to my initial vision. So this first stack of green cake layers here is going to be the zombie's body, and the second stack is going to be its head and its brains. So you can see that I used a lot of different sized cake layers here, and they're going to make it easier for us to create that shape without having to trim our cake layers. I'm also giving my buttercream a really good stir here just because it's been sitting, and sometimes it can develop air bubbles, and giving it a stir helps smooth it out to make it a lot easier to add to your cake. I'm also using a cake board here that has the center cut out just because we're going to be making a tiered cake and our central dowel is going to go through that hole. It's just going to help keep the cake a lot more stable. I added a thin layer of buttercream to my cake board to keep that first cake layer in place, and then I began stacking and frosting my green velvet cake layers. So I started with 2 7-inch cake layers here, and I'm adding a very generous layer of frosting between them. Next, I'm adding a 6-inch cake layer, which is going to be topped with a tiny little 4-inch cake layer. I'm going to use a ton of frosting to help create a smooth, curved slope around these cake layers, and that's going to act as our little zombie's body. I started off by smoothing the frosting with my large offset spatula. I also made sure to make sure the top of the cake was nice and flat because our zombie head is going to be resting on that. And then I used a small piece of acetate sheet to smooth out those curved sides. So once I had crumb coated this cake and I was happy with how smooth it was, I added in my central support. So for this cake, I'm using bubble tea straws, which are actually pretty strong and are a lot easier to work with than wooden dowels, but you could totally use wooden dowels in their place. Once my central dowel was in and I felt that it had gone through that hole in the bottom of the cake board, I also added in 3 additional bubble tea straws, which are going to act as these supports. So I pulled them up and cut right where that frosting line was to create 3 strong pillars that are going to help support the weight of the head of our zombie. I then popped this into the freezer to help it firm up and went to work on the head of my zombie. So I'm using a 4-inch cake board here that I cut a hole in the center of so that it can go on top of that central dowel that we just added onto our zombie body. I'm using a bit of buttercream on this cake board as well, just to help that bottom cake layer stick in place. I'm again spreading a generous amount of frosting between each cake layer, and I'm checking to make sure that they're centered as I build this head. So my bottom 2 cake layers are made with a green velvet cake and some green buttercream, but my top 2 cake layers are going to be the red velvet cake layers that I made, and I'm going to be topping them with some pink buttercream. This is a little bit more work and not 100% necessary, but I love having some type of exciting factor when you cut into a cake, so I thought it'd be fun to have the cake layers match the outside of the cake. Once I had rounded out that top portion of the cake, I added some extra green buttercream to the bottom portion of the cake and smoothed that using an acetate sheet. So you can see I'm creating kind of a ridge here, and that's going to give us a really fun finished look once the cake is fully frosted. I tried to get this as round as I could. I then chilled the head in the freezer and went back to work frosting the bottom portion of this cake. So I'm using some of that purple frosting that we colored earlier. I ended up adding a little bit of black gel food coloring to it to deepen the color. And then I smoothed this out using my small offset spatula and, of course, my acetate sheet. Once I was happy with how smooth the frosting was, I inserted 2 additional bubble tea straws into the cake to act as the zombie arms. I have a funny story behind this actually. I tried to make zombie arm cake pops with the cake tops that we cut off earlier, but the red velvet cake is so moist it actually doesn't hold together very well with frosting, so I ended up just using a bunch of extra frosting to create the little zombie's arms. In the end, it actually was a lot easier and a lot less work, so I'm happy that I was forced to go that route because I think it will make the process easier for you guys too. So I created some sleeves with additional purple frosting, then popped that body of the zombie back into the freezer and began to work on the head again. I'm adding a second thicker layer of pink frosting here and just smoothing it up to the top with my small offset spatula. Once I had smoothed that with my acetate sheet, I placed the remaining pink frosting into a piping bag, and I began to pipe some fun squiggly lines vertically along the cake. So you want to make sure you do these in the same direction so that it really does look like a brain, and you're just covering up where you had spread the pink frosting. I also worked this down a little bit so that way when I added the green frosting and pushed it up the cake, there wouldn't be really a hard line, and the green frosting would kind of overlap the brain. So I'm using a lot of frosting here, and I'm using my small offset spatula to create a bit of texture at the top. And once I had added on that additional buttercream, I smoothed out the entire head using my acetate sheet again. I then put this back in the freezer to allow it to chill before we add on the white chocolate ganache blood, and went back to work on my zombie's arms. So I'm adding a bit of green frosting here onto the exposed bits of the bubble tea straws, and then I'm adding a bit more frosting to the sleeves so that I can push it over the arms and make it look like the arms really are coming out of those sleeves. I smoothed this frosting using my small offset spatula and actually kind of pulled the frosting towards the arms to give the edge of the sleeves a jagged look. Then it was time to add our zombie head onto our cake. So I carefully lifted it up off the cake board by using a small offset spatula and slid it down that central support. So in this case, it's just a regular bubble tea straw. I like to use a large offset spatula to help me lower the cake at a more gradual pace. Sometimes your fingers can get in the way, and that makes the process a lot easier. Once the head was in place, I filled in that gap between the 2 tiers with a bit of extra green frosting, which I then smoothed out using my small offset spatula just to remove any excess, and then of course the corner of my acetate sheet just to get those lines really nice and smooth. To give the shirt a little bit of a collar and make it a bit more exciting, I added some texture to the top of the purple frosting there, just to make the neckline look kind of ripped just like the sleeves. I then cut out some black fondant to create our facial features. So I used a heart cutter for the nose and a circle cutter to create the zombie's eyes. I also added on a little stitch to put on his forehead, and then I carefully pressed these onto my cake. Next, it was time to add our white chocolate ganache blood. So this is super easy to make. It's just a mixture of heavy cream and white chocolate, and then of course a little bit of red gel food coloring. So I added some of this between our brain squiggle frosting and also on the edge of that green frosting. So my ganache was a little bit warm and it ran down slightly further than I had initially planned, but it looked kind of gory and that's what I was after, so it was okay. I also cut out some of my purple frosting with a knife just to make our zombie's shirt look ripped, to give it a bit more of a dramatic look. I also loved how that green frosting kind of peeked through. So a funny story is that I thought the cake was finished at this point, but for some reason I felt like he was missing something. So I decided to add on some kind of cartoonish eyes just to make him look a little bit happier. He's supposed to be scary, but I also wanted him to be cute. I went back and forth on this for a while though because my sketch didn't have eyeballs and I really wasn't sure which I liked better, so I'd love to hear your opinion of which look you prefer. Are you team eyeballs or team no eyeballs? Thank you guys so much for watching this tutorial. I hope you have a wonderful Halloween. If you want to recreate this cake, you can find the recipe on Chelsweets.com. And hopefully, I'll see you guys again soon.